Welcome back to Franchise Player, and in today's video we're going to talk about why I think old games are just better, and specifically better than modern games. Today we're going to dive into the magic of old games, of retro games, and what makes them so special and unique and even hold up today. If you look around online lately, whether it's YouTube, Reddit, wherever else you go and scroll for hours on end, it seems like that old games and retro games are back in action, and I don't know, it seems like they're bigger than ever. At least when I go on my feed, it seems like you see a lot of people, a lot of gamers of all ages, whether they're younger dudes in like their teens or even older gamers and probably their 40s or 50s, talking about why they're going back to old games. And I don't think it's just nostalgia, specifically for the younger gen, maybe for the older gen a bit, right? But it's not just nostalgia for the reason that people are going back to these games. I think with these older games, and when I say older games, I'm talking basically the 7th generation of game consoles and below. So Wii, 360, PS3, dating back all the way to the original Nintendo, right? The NES. So that's a huge section of gaming where a lot of people have never explored those libraries before. And with where modern gaming is currently at, I think these older games and older generations provide an escape and almost a breath of fresh air compared to where gaming is at today. Older games and retro games really, to me, feel like a complete package. I think with older games, right, especially if you're talking pre-7th gen, 6th gen, and even 5th gen of consoles, you really see games that were released in a complete form. Back then, there was not a way to do any kind of online updates or patches or anything like that, so developers really had to make sure a game was dialed in when it was released, because if there was some game-breaking error, some crazy fix that they needed to do, you weren't going to be able to do it. That's just how the game was. Don't get me wrong, in a lot of older games, there's some issues here and there, right? But for the most part, these games are a complete package and work as they should at launch. Where nowadays, you see a lot of games that are released and there's a day one patch, some massive day one install, and updates upon updates for it seems like months. Anytime I pop in a modern game, I'm having to deal with updates. A thing that was really cool about these old games, especially if you've been into modern gaming over the past, I'd even say 10 years at this point, these old games don't require any updates whatsoever. It's pretty cool to just pop in a game, play it, and not have to worry about doing some kind of massive update required to play the game or put it in some kind of playable state. A somewhat recent example of this would be like Cyberpunk 2077, right? Sure, the game is in a great place now, but when it released, I didn't play it at release, but the game was famous basically for being just a giant mess. Back then, you didn't really have issues like that. Games were released in a full playable form, and you didn't have anyone really jumping the gun. You didn't have these companies, specifically large corporate companies, really pressuring these developers and studios to just pump a game out even if it was not ready. Money, business was definitely still a part of releasing video games back then. They just weren't doing it for the hell of it. Obviously, they wanted to make money. But back then, it felt like these companies at least had the developers and studios on a bit longer of a leash, right? Where it's like, hey, if the game's not ready, take your time, release it when it is ready. What I'm really starting to look at retro games as is almost an equivalent to like a classic album or a classic movie. I think you can view games from that same lens, and you don't always have to consume the newest game or the newest movie or the newest song. It's totally okay to go back and appreciate some older stuff, and that's what I do all the time. And it's really cool to play that game or listen to that album and think about how crazy it must have been for the time to play it in that era. Now let's talk about some old games that I've been playing recently. I've been playing a ton of Pokemon Crystal on the 3DS Virtual Console and having a great time. If you go back and play it, right, and you maybe weren't used to the graphics, you may not be a huge fan of it. Personally, I love the graphics on this game. The old school art style, the sprites of the actual Pokemon and the players in the game, I think look incredible, and I think are some of my favorite design in a Pokemon game. The post game is fantastic. This game, I mean, talk about a complete package. This game really feels like a complete package in my eyes, where you were able to go through Johto, go back to Kanto. I'm like 30 something hours deep into Pokemon Crystal. I've been playing the heck out of it on my 3DS. And I mean, talk about a legendary old school game that just holds up and really pushed the Game Boy Color to its limits as well. So that's another cool thing. I mean, just to go off on a side tangent here, what's really cool about going back to some of these older games and consoles is you can look at games that really challenged the hardware of that generation. Like, just for example, like GTA 5 on a PS3 and 360 is pretty impressive considering that was in 2013, and just the specs of the PS3 and the 360. And I think Pokemon Crystal totally falls into that category for the Game Boy Color. Another old game that I've been playing recently is one of my favorite Call of Duties of all time. I don't play modern Call of Duties and haven't really sank time into a Call of Duty probably since Black Ops 3. But the game I've been playing a lot is Black Ops 1, and specifically in Black Ops 1, the Zombies mode. And I feel like Black Ops 1 Zombies is like the perfect blend of old school zombies, but just enough, like a hint of modern zombies to where, you know, with the DLC at least, that it can feel a little more modern. But what's really cool about playing, you know, something like this, and mind you, it's 2010, so it's not like it's an ancient game, but, you know, 15 years old now for Black Ops 1. But what's really cool about it is that this was the golden era of Call of Duty. And, you know, don't get me wrong, I have a ton of nostalgia for this era, but there was definitely DLC, so it's not like Activision was like, hey, go have fun, you know, we're not going to charge you anything extra. But it wasn't required. It's not like it was pay to win. It was just for additional maps. And what I think is really fun about Black Ops 1 Zombies is it's just simple, pick up and play. You're not having to solve, you know, 1,000 Easter eggs or do anything too crazy. It's pretty self-explanatory to get through a map, turn on the power, get your perks, you know, pack a punch of weapon and start having some fun. I think this is another old school game that it just feels right. It's simple enough, it's modern enough, and the online's free on it, which is pretty awesome. Another old game that I've gone back to a bit recently is the first Gears of War. And I know this literally just got a remake slash remaster on PS5 and Series X, but in my opinion, it's not really something I need right now. I might get it down the road. I got this for super cheap not that long ago, and playing through it again and having a good time. Like, this is the definition of a classic game, specifically Xbox, like peak prime Xbox. Back in the 360 era, they were doing quite a bit right. And Gears 1, I mean, sure, the remake is out, but in my opinion, this game still looks good enough for me. Mind you, it's almost 20 years old, so it is, you know, definitely getting up there age-wise. Sometimes you don't need to play the remake. Is it cool to play something that's new, shiny, and, you know, a brand new release, maybe has some online capability? Sure, but I think it's totally fine and totally cool to go back and play the original of a game. Sometimes I think there's too many remakes these days, and like me personally, I'm getting like remake and remaster fatigue. Like, some of these companies need to chill, pump out some original games, and I don't know, they're playing it pretty safe by just re-releasing games. That's another thing I don't really like about modern gaming, right, is that they play it too safe, and we see a ton of remasters. And then the last example here of just some older stuff I've been playing lately would be the Dreamcast and Tokyo Extreme Racer. Talk about a fun game that you can just hop on and play immediately, jump in, start driving around, do some races. Just a great game with a super cool aesthetic that, you know, we'll never see an aesthetic like the Dreamcast again. It's really like the late 90s in console form, which I think is super cool. You know, I didn't start playing games really until like the early 2000s, so it's fun to go back to an era where, you know, I was not really around, and, you know, see what people were playing back then and just see how cool those games still are and explore an era that you weren't really present for, which I think is super dope. And that's another cool thing about going back to some older games compared to modern stuff. And a lot of these games, excluding like some of the more like expensive games like Pokemon and stuff, a lot of these games are pretty cheap. Like, you could pick up a stack of, you know, Xbox 360 games or a stack of PS2 games even for like 50, 60 bucks. I mean, even under $100 and get a ton of games, where nowadays a brand new release is gonna be between like 60 and 80 bucks. So what's really cool also about this generation is that the games are just hella cheap. They're a lot cheaper than the modern stuff. One thing that I wanted to talk about that's kind of a pro and a con of going back to these older console generations is that there's obviously a finite selection of titles available. So they're not making any new original Xbox games. They're not making any new PS1 games. They're not making any new, you know, Game Boy Advance games. What's out there is out there. But what's really cool about that is that with that finite selection of titles available, with there not being any new releases, is that you can really dive into a library of a console. Like, obviously they're not making any new PS1 titles. They're not making any new Game Boy Advance games. They're not making any new original Xbox games. So you can really jump into a library and try to find some underrated games that maybe flew under the radar. Like me personally, I did this with the PS Vita. A lot of people think the Vita was like a total flop and didn't really have any games. From a surface level perspective, like, yeah, that's totally true. But with having a Vita, right, and there not being any new releases for it over the, past 5 years or so, I've been able to really dive into the Vita and find some underrated games and, I'd say hidden gems that I wouldn't have known about otherwise if I didn't go back and revisit this console. But I will say a con of that, to go on the flip side, is that once you've exhausted that library, there's no other new games, so you're stuck with what you have. So, the Vita, I'd say, exhausted that library, so that's a prime example. But with something like the PS2, I mean, you could be digging into that library for years upon years with how many games are on that system, and you'll basically never run out of anything to play. Now let's talk about some of the issues with modern consoles and just modern gaming as a whole. I'm not some massive hater of modern gaming. I think there's always a time and place for it. I like having a modern system like the PS5. It gives me the option to play some new releases if I want to, compared to just sticking on something like the PS3 or a GBA. But with that, new games and new releases, I feel like there's new stuff releasing constantly, especially digitally, stuff that's just getting pumped onto the store, limited physical releases, things like that. I see people fall into a lot of FOMO, like a lot of fear of missing out with new releases. And with older games, you obviously don't have that. With those games already being out for, usually a decade plus at least, you know what games are good, you know what games are worth your time, and you don't have to worry about, potentially buying a game that you may not be a huge fan of. I mean, you can always emulate a game, try it out, and then buy it if you want to go that route. So the FOMO is a big issue that I see in modern gaming, just people constantly buying into the hype, buying into these new games and buying them without even really thinking. On top of that though, this is the first era where we have ever seen console price increases this deep into the console life cycle. Like, I know all of the Xbox consoles just got another price increase. It's happened to certain PlayStation models. I know the Switch 1 surprisingly just got a price increase, or a rumored one not that long ago. So it's actually more expensive nowadays to play modern games than ever. Like back in the day, it would be very common for 3, 4, 5 years into the console life cycle, you'd start to see price drops. Usually a slim variant would come out and things would get cheaper. Now it seems to just be getting more expensive the longer you wait to get a console, which I think is really bad for modern gaming and is, honestly another reason why I'm just cool sticking with some of my older consoles. On top of that, I'd say modern games can kind of feel like a chore at times. A lot of these companies nowadays seem to really only want to release these large open world games with huge, vast environments, and that's cool here and there. I don't know about you, man, but personally, at this point, I'm getting really tired of open world games. I'm cool off them, not really anything I want to play. Open world games just don't really do it for me, especially when there's 1,000 of them out there, and they can get exhausting to play. That's not really something that you just pick up and play. That's one thing I really miss about older console generations, is just the ability to pick up a game, play it for a couple minutes and put it down. Outside of that, modern games seem to love going the live service route, just because, from a company perspective, it makes a ton of sense. Obviously, they want to make as much money as humanly possible. So games like Fortnite, games like 2K that have a ton of microtransactions, of course the companies are going to be huge fans of that because they can charge you a lot more than they would have in the past. Back in the day, you bought a game once, hey, in the 7th gen, there was some DLC, but before that, hey, after you bought that game as a consumer, you were basically done with from the company's perspective. Now, I hate to even say this, but the life value of a customer is so much more and so much longer nowadays because of these microtransactions. And I think it's had a huge negative effect on the industry, because companies are hey, why are we going to release a new game when we can just keep milking people on GTA Online with these shark cards for, a decade at this point? So yeah, not a fan of that at all. I really miss old games. That's why I go back to them. I love playing old games. But that's another reason why, I love playing old games and going back to them. I don't feel bad about playing old games at all. I love exploring old libraries. Next up for consoles that I want to explore would probably be the Super Nintendo. Love that 16-bit art style. Of course, I want to go back and keep playing some Dreamcast games. And I just love playing older systems. Modern gaming is in a really weird place right now. There's some positives with it too. Hey, there's always going to be some new releases to check out. Updates can be beneficial at times. Patches can, of course, be beneficial at times. Having access to so many games at once can be kind of a pro, but also a con. It's a double-edged sword. But yeah, I appreciate you guys hearing me rant on this. As you know, I love collecting retro games and physical games. I don't want you to think this is like a full-on hate video on modern gaming, but old games and retro games are just doing it more and more for me nowadays. Let me know some old games that you're playing. Let me know what you think. Do you like modern games? Do you like old games better, or do you just like modern games better? Really curious to hear what you think. But as usual, appreciate you for watching, and we'll catch you soon with another video.